Rain mixed with blood on Caleb's split lip as the heavy oak door slammed shut forever. He was exactly 16 years old, shivering in a thin flannel shirt, with $214 crumpled in his front pocket. Behind that locked door was a father who had just erased him from the family tree over an argument born of grief and cheap whiskey. Most kids kicked out into the freezing October mud would have broken down or begged to be let back in. Caleb wiped his mouth, turned his back on his childhood, and walked toward a rusted destiny that would eventually tear his small town apart. Arthur Montgomery was not a man who forgave easily, not even his own flesh and blood. When Clara, Caleb's mother, passed away from an aggressive leukemia 2 years prior, the heart of the Montgomery household died with her. What was left was a hollowed-out shell of a home in the rural outskirts of Blackwood, Oregon. Arthur had turned to the bottom of a bourbon bottle to find answers, and when he found none, he turned his seething, unexplainable anger toward his only son. The final fracture happened on a Tuesday evening in late October. Caleb had returned from a grueling 10-hour shift at the local lumber yard. He worked under the table, hauling scrap wood and sweeping sawdust just to keep the electricity running because Arthur had gambled away his disability checks. Caleb walked into the kitchen to find his mother's pristine vintage mechanics toolbox, a cherished heirloom she had painstakingly restored missing from the kitchen counter where it had sat like a shrine. "Where is it?" Caleb had asked, his voice low, a dreadful sinking feeling anchoring in his stomach. Arthur didn't even look up from his recliner. "Sold it to Miller down at the pawn shop. We needed groceries." "You have a bottle of Maker's Mark in your hand, Dad?" "That's not groceries," Caleb replied, his fists trembling. "Those were Mom's." The confrontation escalated with terrifying speed. Arthur, his pride wounded by the cold truth from a teenager, exploded. A glass shattered against the wall. Heavy hands grabbed Caleb by the collar of his shirt. There was a brief, violent struggle in the narrow hallway, ending with Arthur landing a heavy backhand across Caleb's jaw. The metallic taste of blood flooded the boy's mouth. "Get out." Arthur had roared, his face flushed, a dangerous shade of crimson. "If you think you're so grown up, if you think you can disrespect me in my own house, then get the hell off my property. You're no son of mine. Get out and don't ever come back." Caleb didn't pack a bag. He didn't cry. He simply reached into his pocket, felt the crumpled bills from his week's wages, exactly $214, and walked out into the biting, torrential rain. He heard the deadbolt slide into place with a definitive, metallic click. The sound echoed in his ears as he stepped off the porch and into the mud. Blackwood was a town that swallowed people whole. It was a place of dying industries, surrounded by towering pines that seemed to trap the gray clouds over the valley. At 16, Caleb was legally a minor, but out here, the law was a distant concept. If you had nowhere to go, you became a ghost. He walked for miles along the unlit shoulder of County Highway 11. The rain soaked through his flannel, chilling him to the bone. Every passing pair of headlights illuminated the steam rising from his shivering shoulders. He couldn't go to the police. Arthur would likely just talk his way out of it, or worse, Caleb would be thrown into a crowded foster system 3 counties over. He needed shelter, and he needed it now. Hours later, near the edge of the county limit, Caleb stumbled upon the sprawling, overgrown property of Silas Higgins. Silas was an eccentric recluse, a Korean War veteran who ran a disorganized agricultural salvage yard. The property was a graveyard of mechanical beasts, rusting combines, skeletal tractors, and rotting pickup trucks sinking slowly into the earth. To the town, it was an eyesore. To Caleb, whose mother had taught him how to read an engine block before he could read a book, it looked like a sanctuary. He slipped under a sagging section of chain link fence, careful to avoid the jagged wire. The rain was coming down in sheets now, blurring his vision. He wove through rows of decaying machinery until he found a dilapidated, open-faced pole barn. Inside, surrounded by towers of bald tires and rusted axles, sat the husk of a tractor. It was barely more than a chassis covered a tarp. Exhausted, shivering violently, and nursing a throbbing jaw, Caleb dragged a piece of moldy canvas over himself and curled up in the dry dirt beneath the tractor's rear axle. He closed his eyes, the roar of the rain on the tin roof masking the quiet, steady sound of a 16-year-old boy finally allowing a single tear to fall for the mother he missed and the father he had just lost. Caleb woke to the terrifying sensation of cold steel pressing against the side of his neck. His eyes snapped open. The rain had stopped, replaced by the pale, weak light of a cloudy morning. Standing over him, illuminated by the dawn, was Silas Higgins. The old man's face was a map of deep wrinkles and sun-damaged skin, framed by a wild gray beard. In his hands, gripped with surprising steadiness, was a double-barreled shotgun. "Give me one good reason I shouldn't introduce you to the Almighty right here and now." "Boy," Silas rasped, his voice sounding like two rocks grinding together. Caleb slowly raised his hands, keeping his eyes locked on the old man's. "I needed a place to sleep. It was raining. I didn't steal anything." Silas squinted, the barrel of the gun not wavering an inch. He took in the boy's bruised jaw, the mud-caked clothes, and the sheer desperation in his eyes. Slowly, agonizingly, Silas lowered the weapon. "You're Arthur Montgomery's kid," Silas said, spitting a dark stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "I heard the yelling from the road yesterday when I went to town. Heard he finally tossed you." "I left." Caleb lied, his voice tight. "Sure you did." Silas turned around, limping slightly as he walked toward the barn entrance. "Get up. I don't run a charity. If you're on my land, you're working or you're walking. Which is it?" Caleb scrambled out from under the tarp. "I can work. I know engines. My mom taught me." Silas paused, glancing back. Everyone in Blackwood knew about Clara Montgomery's golden hands. She could make a dead carburetor sing. "All right, but I ain't paying you a dime. You get a cot in the tack room and whatever I don't finish for dinner." Caleb looked at the rusted hunk of metal he had slept under. In the daylight, he could see it clearly. It was a 1953 Ford Jubilee. The paint, originally a proud red and gray, was now entirely consumed by a scabby, flaking rust. The tires were rotted flat, the steering wheel was cracked down the middle, and the engine block looked like a solid chunk of oxidized iron. It was, by all accounts, completely beyond saving. "What about this?" Caleb asked, gesturing to the tractor. Silas scoffed. "That piece of junk? Been sitting there since '85. Seized solid. Guy named Elias Thorne, rest his rotten soul, dumped it here to pay off a gambling debt. Not worth the scrap metal it's made of." An idea, reckless and desperate, sparked in Caleb's mind. He needed something of his own. He needed a way out. A project. A lifeline. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his crumpled wad of cash. "I'll buy it from you," Caleb said. Silas let out a harsh, barking laugh. "With what? That fistful of lint?" $200, Caleb said, stepping forward. He peeled off the bills, holding back $14 for absolute emergencies, $200 cash right now, for the tractor, and the right to use your scrap pile to fix it on my off hours. Silas looked at the money, then at the boy. It was a terrible deal for Caleb. The tractor was literal garbage. But Silas saw the fire in the kid's eyes, a fire that Arthur Montgomery had tried and failed to extinguish. "You're dumber than a bag of hammers, kid," Silas grunted, snatching the money from Caleb's hand. "It's yours. But don't go crying to me when you realize you bought a 2,000-pound paperweight." For the next 3 weeks, Caleb's life became a grueling cycle of survival. From sunrise to sunset, he crushed scrap, sorted alternators, and hauled heavy iron for Silas. His hands grew calloused and perpetually stained with black grease. He ate canned beans and stale bread, sleeping on a thin mattress in a shed that smelled of mouse droppings and gasoline. But every evening, under the harsh glare of a single hanging halogen bulb, he went to work on the Jubilee. He started with a wire brush, painstakingly scrubbing away decades of decay. He drained oil that looked like black molasses and chipped away hardened mud from the undercarriage. It was brutal, solitary work, but the rhythmic scraping and turning of wrenches kept his mind off the warm bed he had lost and the father who hadn't come looking for him. It happened on a Tuesday night. Caleb was lying on a piece of cardboard underneath the belly of the tractor, struggling to remove the heavily rusted oil pan. He was using a breaker bar, putting all of his meager, 16-year-old body weight into loosening a particularly stubborn bolt near the rear axle housing. The bolt suddenly snapped with a loud crack. Caleb's knuckles smashed into the cast iron, tearing the skin. He swore loudly, dropping the wrench and grabbing his bleeding hand. As he lay there, cursing his luck, the halogen light hit the undercarriage at a strange angle. Caleb paused. He shuffled closer, wiping the grease from his eyes. Right above the rear differential, tucked away in a cavity where no structural metal had any business being, was a steel box. It wasn't an original part of the Ford Jubilee. It was heavily, messily welded directly onto the chassis, covered in thick black undercoating to hide it from a casual glance. If Caleb hadn't been directly underneath it, scraping away the grime to reach that broken bolt, he never would have seen it. His heart began to hammer against his ribs. Why would someone weld a heavy steel box to the underside of a farm tractor? He scrambled out from under the chassis, ran to Silas's workbench, and grabbed an angle grinder. Plugging it into the extension cord, he slid back under the tractor. The sparks rained down on him like miniature fireworks, burning tiny holes in his shirt as he cut through the thick, amateur welds. With a final groan of stressed metal, the box dropped, hitting Caleb right in the chest and knocking the wind out of him. It was incredibly heavy for its size, about the dimensions of a large shoebox. He hauled it out into the light, setting it on the dirt floor. It was sealed with a heavy brass padlock that had turned green with age. Taking a heavy pair of bolt cutters, Caleb snapped the lock. His hands were shaking. He didn't know if he was about to find decades-old tools, forgotten cash, or something terrible. He flipped the lid open. Inside, tightly wrapped in several layers of yellowed, oil-soaked canvas, were bundles of paper. Caleb peeled back the canvas carefully. The breath hitched in his throat. They were bonds. Dozens of them. Bearer bonds. Crisp and untouched by the rust and decay that had consumed the machine around them. And resting on top of the bundles was a small, leather-bound ledger notebook, its pages filled with neat, meticulous handwriting, detailing names, dates, and massive sums of money transferred through offshore accounts. Caleb opened the first page of the ledger. The very first name written on the list, dated 14 years ago, was someone Caleb recognized instantly. Arthur Montgomery, $150,000. Caleb stared at the name, the blood freezing in his veins. The father who claimed to be broke, who had sold his dead wife's tools to buy cheap liquor, who had kicked Caleb out into the freezing rain with nothing, was tied to a fortune hidden in the belly of a dead man's tractor. And as Caleb looked at the other names on the list, realizing they belonged to the mayor, the local sheriff, and the wealthiest businessman in Blackwood, he realized he hadn't just bought a tractor for $200. He had bought the town's darkest, most dangerous secret. The silence in the pole barn was deafening, broken only by the erratic drumming of rain starting up again on the tin roof. Caleb sat cross-legged in the dirt, the rusted underbelly of the 1953 Ford Jubilee looming over him like a silent guardian. In his grease-stained, trembling hands, he held more wealth than he had ever seen in his entire life. Bearer bonds were a relic of a bygone financial era. Caleb only knew what they were because his mother, Clara, used to read historical mystery novels aloud to him when he was younger. Unlike regular stocks or registered bonds, bearer bonds didn't have a registered owner's name on them. Whoever physically held the paper owned the money. They were essentially untraceable cash, favored by corporations in the mid-20th century and notoriously exploited by criminals for that exact reason. Caleb counted the bundles. There were 50 of them. Each bundle contained 10 certificates, and each certificate was printed with a denomination of $10,000. $5 million. He dropped the bundle he was holding as if it had suddenly caught fire. His breath came in short, shallow gasps. $5 million hidden inside a dead man's tractor in a scrapyard that the whole town considered a pathetic eyesore. But it was the ledger that terrified him more than the money. The little leather-bound book felt heavier than the steel box it came in. He traced his thumb over the first entry again, Arthur Montgomery, $150,000, paid in full October 14th. The year listed was exactly 14 years ago. Caleb had been 2 years old. Memories assaulted him, unbidden and sharp. He remembered the bone-deep poverty of his childhood. He remembered his mother crying at the kitchen table over past-due electricity bills, her hands blistered from picking up extra shifts, sewing alterations for the wealthy folks in the neighboring county. He remembered eating generic macaroni and cheese for weeks on end while his father sat in his recliner, staring blankly at the wall, radiating a toxic, suffocating bitterness. If his father had received $150,000, where did it go? And why was Arthur Montgomery's name listed alongside Mayor Harrison Cole and Sheriff Clayton Briggs? "Hey, kid!" The gruff shout from across the junkyard snapped Caleb back to reality. It was Silas. The old man's heavy boots were crunching on the gravel, making his way toward the pole barn. Panic, pure and instinctual, seized Caleb's chest. If Silas saw the money, he would rightfully claim it. The tractor was Caleb's. But a fortune like this changed people. It made decent men do terrible things. He couldn't trust anyone. Moving with frantic speed, Caleb shoved the bundles of bonds back into the steel box. He slammed the lid shut, grabbed the broken brass padlock, and jammed it back through the latch to make it look somewhat secure. He shoved the box deep into a pile of oily rags and discarded radiator hoses in the darkest corner of the barn, quickly tossing an old, moth-eaten canvas tarp over the pile. He barely had time to slide back underneath the tractor and grab his breaker bar before Silas's shadow fell over the entrance. You're burning midnight oil and my electricity, boy, Silas grunted, leaning heavily on a rusty iron pipe he used as a walking stick. He squinted at Caleb, noticing the fresh grease smeared across the boy's pale face and the wild look in his eyes. You look like you just saw a ghost. You alright? I'm fine, Caleb said, his voice cracking slightly. He cleared his throat and tapped the heavy iron of the engine block with his wrench. Just snapped a bolt on the oil pan. Smashed my knuckles. It spooked me. Silas snorted, stepping closer and peering at the tractor. I told you it was a rusted piece of junk. Elias Finch drove that thing into the ground, and when he couldn't drive it no more, he used it to cover his tabs. You're wasting your youth on a lost cause. It's not a lost cause, Caleb said defensively, wiping his bloody knuckles on his jeans. The block isn't cracked. If I can get the cylinders to break loose, I can rebuild the carburetor. It just needs time. Silas shook his head, a mixture of pity and begrudging respect in his eyes. Suit yourself. But shut those lights off in 10 minutes. I ain't made of money. As Silas hobbled away back toward his dilapidated cabin, Caleb let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding for an hour. He dragged himself out from under the tractor, his muscles screaming in protest. He looked at the pile of rags hiding $5 million. His life had just fractured into a terrifying before and after. He didn't sleep that night. Lying on his lumpy cot in the tack room, listening to the mice scurry in the walls, Caleb formulated a plan. He needed to know what happened 14 years ago. He needed to know why Elias Finch hid the money and why his father was paid off. Tomorrow, he would have to go back into Blackwood. The town of Blackwood looked exactly as Caleb had left it 3 weeks ago, gray, depressed, and slowly dying. The main street was a collection of faded brick facades, half of which were boarded up. The air always smelled faintly of pine sap and the stagnant water from the abandoned lumber mill on the edge of town. Caleb walked with his head down, the collar of his flannel pulled up against the biting November wind. He had scrubbed the grease from his hands with harsh pumice soap until his skin was raw, wanting to look as unremarkable as possible. The leather ledger was safely tucked into the waistband of his jeans, hidden by his oversized jacket. His destination was the Blackwood Public Library, a modest stone building that smelled of dust and old binding glue. It was the only place in town that held the municipal archives. He pushed through the heavy glass doors. The librarian, Mrs. Abigail Henderson, a severe-looking woman with wire-rimmed glasses, looked up from her desk. She frowned slightly, recognizing him. Everyone knew Caleb had been thrown out by Arthur. In a town this small, tragedy was a spectator sport. Caleb, she said, her tone a mix of sternness and underlying sympathy. Shouldn't you be in school? I'm doing an independent study project. Mrs. Henderson. Caleb lied smoothly, a skill he had perfected living with his father. Local history. I need to look at the newspaper archives from 2012, October specifically. She sighed, clearly not believing the school excuse. But she didn't press the issue. They're on the microfiche in the back. Do you remember how to use the machine? Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Caleb hurried to the back of the library, sitting at the bulky, outdated machine. He loaded the spool of film for October 2012 and began turning the dial, watching the ghostly images of old newspaper front pages speed across the illuminated screen. He stopped on the edition for October 12th. The headline took up half the page. Blackwood Mill declares bankruptcy, thousands lose jobs, pension fund empty. Caleb leaned in, his eyes scanning the dense columns of text. The article detailed a catastrophic financial collapse of the town's primary employer, the Blackwood Lumber Mill. According to the report, a series of disastrous investments by the board of directors had drained the company's operating capital. But the real tragedy was the complete evaporation of the workers' pension fund. Millions of dollars simply gone. The investigation at the time had concluded it was gross mismanagement, not criminal fraud. The money had been lost in the complex web of offshore shell companies. Caleb's heart hammered. He pulled the leather ledger from his waistband and opened it beneath the desk. He cross-referenced the names. The CEO of the mill? Harrison Cole, the current mayor of Blackwood. The lead investigator for the county who cleared the board of criminal wrongdoing? Clayton Briggs, the current sheriff. The union representative who convinced the workers to settle for pennies on the dollar and not pursue federal litigation? Caleb felt a physical sickness wash over him. The name in the paper was Arthur Montgomery, his father. It all made a sickening kind of sense now. The mill's board hadn't lost the pension fund. They had stolen it. They converted the stolen millions into untraceable bearer bonds to hide the wealth. But to get away with it, they needed the union to stand down, and they needed the local law enforcement to turn a blind eye. They had bought his father's silence for $150,000. Arthur had sold out his friends, his neighbors, and his own integrity. The guilt, Caleb realized, must have been what broke him. The guilt and the paranoia. Arthur couldn't spend the money without drawing suspicion from the ruined townspeople, so he likely lost it all in the underground gambling rings across the state line, eventually drinking himself into a violent stupor to forget what he had done. And Elias Finch? According to another article Caleb found 2 days later in the archives, Elias was the mill's chief accountant. He was the man who likely orchestrated the transfer to bearer bonds. Elias must have gotten cold feet, stolen the bonds back from the conspirators, and hidden them in the belly of his tractor before he accidentally drowned in the quarry a month later. Caleb shoved the ledger back into his pants, his mind racing. He was sitting on the stolen futures of half the town. He was also holding the only evidence that could put the mayor and the sheriff in federal prison. Fascinating reading, isn't it? Caleb jumped, nearly knocking the chair over. Standing right behind him, his thumbs tucked into his duty belt, was Sheriff Clayton Briggs. Briggs was a massive man, built like a brick wall, with cold, dead eyes that didn't match his folksy, smiling demeanor. He looked down at the microfiche screen, noting the article about the mill collapse. Just doing a history project? Caleb stammered, his blood running cold. Did Briggs see the ledger? History, Briggs mused, his smile failing to reach his eyes. A dangerous subject. History. Tends to dig up things better left buried in the dirt. I heard your old man kicked you to the curb, Caleb. Tragic, really. I also heard you've been squatting over at old Silas Higgins' scrapyard. I'm working for my keep, Caleb said, forcing himself to hold the sheriff's gaze. Briggs leaned down, his face inches from Caleb's. The smell of peppermint and stale coffee was overpowering. You're a smart kid, Clara's boy. You've got your mother's brains. Don't go wasting them poking around in old town gossip. People around here, they care about moving forward, not looking backward. Understand? I understand, Caleb whispered. Briggs patted Caleb hard on the shoulder, a gesture that felt more like a threat than a comfort. Good. Say hello to Silas for me. Tell him I'll be by soon to check his environmental permits. Place is a hazard. Briggs turned and walked out of the library. Caleb sat frozen for a long time, the implications of the sheriff's words echoing in his mind. They knew he was at the junkyard. When Caleb finally made it back to Silas's property as the sun was beginning to set, he noticed something was wrong immediately. The heavy chain link gate, which Silas always kept padlocked after 5 p.m., was hanging wide open. Caleb broke into a sprint, his boots tearing through the muddy gravel. He rounded the corner of a crushed school bus and saw the pole barn. A sleek black SUV was parked near the entrance. A man Caleb didn't recognize, wearing a heavy leather jacket and work boots, was standing over the 1953 Ford Jubilee. He had a crowbar in his hand and was violently smashing the hood of the tractor, prying at the rusted metal panels, frantically searching for something. Hey! Caleb screamed, rushing forward, fear entirely replaced by a blinding, protective rage. Get away from that! The man spun around, raising the crowbar. He had a scarred, brutal face. He took one look at Caleb, sneered, and stepped forward, fully intending to swing the heavy iron bar at the teenager's head. Before the man could take a second step, the deafening boom of a 1-2 gauge shotgun shattered the evening air. The windshield of the black SUV exploded into a million glittering pieces. Caleb and the thug both froze. Stepping out from the shadows of a rusted combine harvester was Silas Higgins. The old man had the shotgun raised to his shoulder, the barrel smoking, his eyes blazing with a feral intensity. He pumped the action, loudly chambering another shell. The next one, Silas roared, his voice cutting through the ringing in Caleb's ears. Goes in your kneecap. Drop the bar and get off my land before I fertilize my weeds with you. The man dropped the crowbar. He looked at Silas, then at Caleb, a dark promise in his eyes. He backed away slowly, got into the ruined SUV, and sped off, the tires spinning wildly in the mud. Silas slowly lowered the shotgun. He turned to Caleb, his expression unreadable beneath his wild beard. He looked at the boy, then looked at the freshly pried open panels of the old, worthless Ford Jubilee. All right, kid, Silas said quietly, the gravelly harshness gone from his voice, replaced by a deadly seriousness. You've got about 10 seconds to tell me exactly what it is you bought for me for $200 and why a city heavy just tried to dismantle it. Caleb stared at the smoking barrel of the shotgun, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The acrid smell of burnt gunpowder hung thick in the damp evening air, mixing with the scent of wet earth and rusted iron. He looked from the shattered glass of the fleeing SUV back to Silas, whose grizzled face was set in a mask of deadly anticipation. 10 seconds, kid, Silas repeated, his grip tightening on the wooden stock of the weapon. And if you lie to me, you can pack your bags and start walking. I don't harbor criminals, and I sure as hell don't harbor targets. Caleb swallowed hard. He had a choice to make. Right here in the mud. He could grab his few belongings and run into the night, hoping to hitchhike out of Blackwood before the sheriff's men found him. Or he could trust the cranky, isolated veteran who had just saved his life. I didn't buy a tractor, Caleb said, his voice shaking but gaining strength. I bought a vault. He turned, walked past the battered Ford Jubilee, and headed to the dark corner of the pole barn. Throwing aside the moth-eaten canvas tarp, he dug through the pile of oily rags and hauled out the heavy steel box. He carried it over to Silas's workbench, setting it down with a heavy, metallic thud. Silas limped over, his eyes narrowing. He watched as Caleb slid the broken brass padlock out of the latch and flipped the heavy lid open. The old man's breath hitched. He reached out with a trembling, calloused hand, entirely ignoring the bundles of bearer bonds, and picked up the leather-bound ledger resting on top. He flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the meticulous handwriting of Elias Finch. When he reached the entries detailing the Blackwood Lumber Mills pension fund distribution, Silas let out a low, dangerous whistle. $5 million, Caleb whispered, pointing to the stacks of paper. In untraceable bearer bonds. It's the town's pension fund. They stole it, Silas. Mayor Cole, Sheriff Briggs, and my dad. They took it all and blamed the market. Silas didn't look at the money. He kept staring at the ledger, his jaw clenching so tight Caleb thought his teeth might crack. My brother, Henry, Silas began, his voice barely a rasp. He worked at that mill for 35 years, breathed sawdust until his lungs gave out. When the pension vanished, he couldn't afford his oxygen tanks or his mortgage. He shot himself in his living room 2 days before the bank foreclosed. Silas slammed the ledger down on the workbench. The sound echoed like a gunshot. I always knew it wasn't just bad investments, Silas growled, looking out toward the dark gates of the junkyard. Harrison Cole was a snake in a suit, and Clayton Briggs was his personal attack dog. But I never had proof. Just the ramblings of a bitter old man living in the trash. He turned his gaze to Caleb. And your father? $150,000, Caleb said, the shame burning his cheeks. Hush money. To keep the union quiet. He blew it all and drank himself to death while we starved. So, what's your play, boy? Silas asked, leaning against the bench. You're holding a winning lottery ticket that also happens to be a death warrant? That goon who just left? That was one of Briggs' off-the-books deputies. They know Elias Finch stashed the bonds before he took his little swim in the quarry. And they just figured out where. I have to go to the feds, Caleb said, the realization settling over him. Local cops are bought and paid for. State police might be too. I need to get this ledger and a sample of the bonds to the FBI field office in Portland. Portland is a 4-hour drive. Assuming you don't get pulled over by Briggs' deputies before you hit the county line, Silas pointed out, scratching his beard. They control the roads out of Blackwood, and now they know you're sitting on their retirement plan. We need to hide this stash. Right now. Somewhere they won't look. Silas walked over to a massive pile of discarded industrial equipment. He pointed to a rusted, heavy-duty acetylene cylinder. Cut the bottom out of that tank yesterday. Was going to scrap the brass valve. We stuffed the bonds in there, weld a scrap plate back over the bottom, and bury it under a ton of crushed engine blocks using the excavator. They can tear this whole barn apart and they won't find it. They worked with frantic precision. Caleb wrapped the bonds tightly in fresh plastic sheeting, stuffing them deep inside the hollowed-out tank. Silas fired up his welding torch, the bright blue arc illuminating the dark barn as he sealed the steel plate over the bottom, turning the tank into an impenetrable vault. Using the rusted yellow excavator, Silas buried the tank beneath a mountain of twisted scrap metal that would take a crew of men days to move by hand. Caleb kept the leather ledger tucked into his jacket, along with 2 of the $10,000 bonds as physical evidence. Just as the excavator's engine rattled to a halt, the piercing sweep of headlights washed over the junkyard gates. A battered pickup truck idled at the entrance. The driver's side door opened, and a figure stumbled out into the mud, clutching a bottle in a brown paper bag. Caleb's blood ran cold. He recognized the hunched shoulders and the unsteady gait instantly. It was Arthur Montgomery. Arthur stood at the edge of the crushed gravel driveway, squinting into the glare of the work lights. He looked worse than Caleb remembered. His clothes were rumpled, his face heavily unshaven, and he possessed the frantic, hollowed-out look of a man who had backed himself into a corner he couldn't fight his way out of. "Caleb!" Arthur yelled, his voice carrying a desperate, pleading edge over the ambient noise of the scrapyard. "Caleb! Son! Are you out here?" Caleb stepped out from the shadows of the pole barn, his fists clenched at his sides. Silas stayed back in the darkness, his shotgun resting casually but purposefully across his forearm. "I'm not your son," Caleb said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through his veins. "You made that perfectly clear 3 weeks ago." Arthur staggered forward, throwing his hands up in a gesture of surrender. "I was drunk, kid, I was grieving your mother, and I was angry, and I made a mistake. I came to bring you home. It's freezing out here. You don't belong in a junkyard." Caleb let out a bitter, humorless laugh. "You didn't come looking for me for 3 weeks? You didn't care if I froze to death in a ditch? But today, right after I go to the library and look up the mill collapse, and right after Sheriff Briggs finds out I bought Elias Finch's old tractor, suddenly you're Father of the Year?" Arthur froze. The facade of the concerned parent instantly evaporated, replaced by raw, unadulterated panic. He dropped the brown paper bag. The glass bottle shattered against a rock, spilling cheap whiskey into the dirt. "You don't know what you're messing with, Caleb," Arthur hissed, closing the distance between them, looking over his shoulder as if the shadows themselves were listening. "Briggs came to the house. He knows you have it. Whatever you found on that tractor, you have to give it to me. They will kill you, Caleb. They will kill us both." "Like they killed Elias?" Caleb challenged, stepping closer to his father, fueled by a decade of repressed anger. "Did you help them drown him, Dad? Did you use the $150,000 to buy the rope?" Arthur flinched as if he had been physically struck. Tears welled in his bloodshot eyes. "I didn't know they were going to kill him. I swear to God. Caleb, they just told me if I signed the union settlement, I'd be taken care of. I didn't know they stole the whole fund until it was too late. And by then, Briggs had leverage. He told me if I ever spoke up, he'd make sure Clara and you had a fatal car accident. So you took the money and drank it away while Mom died, working her fingers to the bone." Caleb spat the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "You're a coward." "I am a coward!" Arthur screamed, falling to his knees in the mud. "But I'm trying to save your life right now. Briggs is coming. He has deputies blocking the highway, and he's bringing a team here tonight to tear this place to the ground. Give me the money, Caleb. I'll take it to them. I'll tell them you didn't look at it, and we can just leave town." "Too late for that, Arthur." A booming, authoritative voice echoed from the gate. 3 county sheriff cruisers rolled into the junkyard, their headlights blinding, light bars flashing red and blue against the rusted metal mountains. The doors opened in unison. Sheriff Clayton Briggs stepped out, flanked by 4 deputies holding heavy flashlights and tactical shotguns. Briggs smiled, adjusting his heavy-duty belt. He looked down at Arthur, kneeling in the mud, with absolute disgust. "I sent you in here to quietly retrieve county property, Arthur. Not to put on a theatrical performance." Briggs turned his cold gaze to Caleb. "Well, boy, you've had a busy day. Found a piece of history? Now be a good citizen and hand over the box." Before Caleb could speak, the distinct sound of a pump-action shotgun echoed from the roof of the pole barn. "You're trespassing on private property." "Clayton," Silas barked. The old man had somehow managed to climb the scaffolding at the back of the barn and was now perched on the corrugated tin roof, his weapon aimed squarely at the sheriff's chest. "I don't recall inviting the law in." Briggs didn't even flinch. He just sighed. "Silas, you're an old, crippled man. You really want to die defending a runaway kid in a pile of garbage?" "I've got nothing but time and ammunition," Briggs Silas yelled back. "And I know what you're looking for. It ain't here. I burned the tractor to the chassis. There's nothing left." "I don't believe you," Briggs said, motioning for his deputies to fan out. "Tear the barn apart. If the old man twitches, put him down." "Caleb, run!" Silas roared. Simultaneously, Silas reached down and threw a massive breaker switch mounted on the roof's utility pole. The junkyard erupted into chaos. A deafening mechanical siren, an old air raid alarm Silas had wired to his perimeter, began to wail, completely disorienting the deputies. At the same time, The massive industrial electromagnet suspended from the scrapyard crane swung wildly on its automated track, drawn magnetically toward the sheriff's cruisers. With a screech of tearing metal, the massive magnet slammed onto the hood of Briggs's lead cruiser, crushing the engine block and violently dragging the car sideways. The deputies scattered in panic, raising their weapons toward the crane and the roof. Caleb didn't hesitate. He grabbed his father by the collar, hauling him up from the mud. "Get up!" he screamed over the siren. "Run!" He didn't know why he did it. After everything Arthur had done, leaving him to Briggs would have been poetic justice. But Caleb wasn't a killer, and he wasn't going to let his father be the collateral damage of a corrupt town's secrets. Caleb sprinted toward the back fence of the junkyard, hauling Arthur along with him. The woods bordered the rear of Silas's property, leading to a dense network of abandoned logging roads that Caleb knew like the back of his hand. Behind them, gunfire erupted. The staccato pop-pop-pop of the deputies' rifles clashed with the booming roar of Silas's shotgun providing covering fire. "Where are we going?" Arthur gasped, clutching his chest as they burst through the rusted chain-link gate and plunged into the pitch-black tree line. Branches whipped at Caleb's face, tearing his skin, but he didn't slow down. He could hear shouts and the barking of dogs behind them. To the old mill quarry, Caleb yelled back, his hand instinctively touching his chest to ensure the leather ledger was still tucked safely in his jacket. Elias Finch's truck is still rotting in the ravine down there. If I can hotwire the ignition, we're driving to Portland. "We'll never make it," Arthur cried. "We don't have a choice," Caleb said, his eyes fixed on the darkness ahead. He was no longer just a boy kicked out in the rain. He was the keeper of Blackwood's sins, and he was going to burn the whole corrupt system to the ground. Rain lashed against Caleb's face like frozen needles as he dragged his father through the suffocating darkness of the Blackwood pine forest. The agonizing, rhythmic burn in his lungs was secondary to the sheer terror gripping his heart. Behind them, the wail of Silas's air raid siren faded into the distance, replaced by the terrifying, echoing barks of tracking hounds and the sweeping beams of high-powered flashlights cutting through the trees. "I can't, Caleb. I can't keep going," Arthur wheezed, his boots slipping on the slick, muddy carpet of decaying pine needles. He collapsed against the trunk of a massive Douglas fir, clutching his chest, his face pale and slick with sweat and rain. "You have to," Caleb urged, his voice cracking as he hauled his father back to his feet. "The quarry is just over this ridge. Elias's old truck is at the bottom of the access ravine. If they haven't crushed it yet, I can get it running. We just need to beat the dogs." They crested the ridge. Below them lay the Blackwood Mill Quarry, a massive, jagged scar in the earth filled with black, stagnant water. At the edge of the access road, half swallowed by blackberry brambles and overgrown ferns, sat the rusted, decaying hull of a 1998 Ford F-150. It had belonged to Elias Finch, abandoned here on the night he was murdered, left to rot by a sheriff's department that had no interest in conducting a real investigation. Caleb practically slid down the steep, rocky embankment, tearing the knees of his jeans and scraping his palms raw. He reached the truck and ripped the driver's side door open with a brutal yank. The interior smelled of mildew and dead leaves. He popped the hood, praying to whatever higher power was listening that the engine block wasn't seized like the tractor's had been. He didn't have keys. He didn't have his mother's pristine toolbox. He had a pocket knife, a scrap of copper wire he'd shoved into his pocket at the junkyard, and pure desperation, working purely by touch in the pitch black, Caleb stripped the casing off the ignition wires under the steering column. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely twist the copper together. He sparked the starter wire against the hot lead. The engine clicked, groaned, and died. "Come on," Caleb whispered, tears of frustration mixing with the rain on his cheeks. He sparked it again. Click, whir, silence. Suddenly, a blinding white light pinned them against the side of the truck. "End of the line, Arthur." Sheriff Clayton Briggs's voice echoed down the ravine, unnaturally calm and amplified by a bullhorn. Standing on the ridge above them, silhouetted by the harsh glare of tactical flashlights, were Briggs and 3 deputies. Briggs held a scoped hunting rifle, the crosshairs undoubtedly resting right on Caleb's chest. "There's nowhere left to run. Throw the ledger up here, and I'll make sure you both get a clean cell. Make me come down there, and Elias Finch is going to get some company at the bottom of that water." Caleb froze, his hand hovering over the exposed ignition wires. He looked at his father. Arthur Montgomery, the man who had traded his soul for a bottle of whiskey, stared back. In that fraction of a second, something shifted in the older man's hollow eyes. The cowardice vanished. replaced by a devastating, absolute clarity. "I ruined your life, Caleb," Arthur whispered, his voice incredibly steady. "I let them kill Elias, and I let your mother work herself into an early grave because I was too weak to stand up to them. I can't fix the past, but I can fix tonight." Before Caleb could comprehend what was happening, Arthur ripped off his heavy canvas jacket. He snatched a rusted, heavy length of iron pipe from the truck bed, wrapped the jacket tightly around it to mimic the shape of the ledger, and stepped out from behind the cover of the Ford. "Dad, no!" Caleb screamed. "Clayton!" Arthur roared, his voice echoing off the sheer rock walls of the quarry. He held the jacket-wrapped bundle high above his head. "I've got the book right here. You want it? Come down and get it from me yourself, you corrupt son of a bitch." Arthur threw the bundle as hard as he could toward the deep, black water of the quarry. Briggs panicked. Believing the multi-million-dollar evidence was about to sink into the abyss, he shifted his rifle away from Caleb and aimed at Arthur. The rifle cracked like thunder. Arthur jolted violently backward, clutching his shoulder as he crumpled into the mud. "No!" Caleb shrieked. Adrenaline, pure and blinding, flooded his system. He slammed the copper wires together. The old Ford's engine caught, sputtered, and roared to life with a deafening, unmuffled explosion of exhaust. Caleb threw it into gear, intending to use the heavy steel of the truck as a battering ram to shield his father. But before the tires could even spin in the mud, the ridge above exploded in a sea of flashing red and blue lights that completely dwarfed the deputies' flashlights. Sirens, dozens of them, pitched differently than the local county cruisers shattered the night. Heavy, armored vehicles swarmed the quarry access road, cutting off Briggs's escape route entirely. "Federal Bureau of Investigation! Drop your weapons and step away from the edge!" A booming, authoritative voice commanded through a loudspeaker. Special Agent Gregory Hayes, leading a heavily armed tactical team from the Portland FBI field office, stormed the ridge. Silas Higgins hadn't just thrown a breaker switch to create a distraction. The wily old veteran had used his ham radio to bypass the local cell towers and contact the federal authorities hours ago, the moment he verified the ledger's authenticity. He had given them the exact coordinates of the scrapyard and the quarry. Briggs, realizing he was entirely outgunned and surrounded by federal agents, slowly lowered his rifle and raised his hands in surrender. His deputies dropped their shotguns to the dirt, falling to their knees. Caleb didn't care about the arrests. He dove out of the idling truck and slid through the mud to his father's side. Arthur was bleeding heavily from a through-and-through wound to his upper shoulder, gasping for air, but his eyes were open. "I got them to look away, kid." Arthur coughed, a weak, bloody smile touching his lips. "Did I get them to look away?" "You did, Dad," Caleb choked out, pressing his hands hard against the wound to stop the bleeding. "You did good. Just hold on." Special Agent Hayes scrambled down the embankment, a team of paramedics trailing closely behind him. As the medics took over, lifting Arthur onto a stretcher, Hayes knelt in the mud next to Caleb. "You Caleb Montgomery?" Hayes asked, his eyes taking in the battered, grease-stained 16-year-old. Caleb nodded slowly. Reaching into the inner pocket of his flannel shirt, he pulled out the dry, completely intact leather-bound ledger and the two bearer bonds. He handed them to the federal agent. "The rest of it, $5 million, is welded inside a hollowed-out acetylene tank buried under the scrap pile at Silas Higgins' yard," Caleb said, his voice finally steadying. "It belongs to the people of Blackwood." Hayes took the ledger, his eyes widening as he flipped open the cover. He looked back at Caleb with a profound mixture of shock and respect. "Son, you just bought back the future of an entire town." The trial of Mayor Harrison Cole and Sheriff Clayton Briggs made national headlines, unearthing a labyrinth of corruption that had strangled Blackwood for over a decade. The recovery of the $5 million in bearer bonds allowed the federal government to reinstate the stolen lumber mill pension fund, saving hundreds of families from financial ruin. Arthur Montgomery survived his gunshot wound. He served a short, reduced sentence for his prior complicity, finally finding the sobriety and redemption he had spent 14 years running from. Caleb never went back to high school. Instead, armed with a substantial federal whistleblower reward, he officially purchased Silas Higgins' scrapyard. He transformed it from a graveyard of rusted metal into Blackwood's premier automotive restoration business. Sitting in the center of his pristine new showroom, fully restored and gleaming in perfect red and gray paint, was the 1953 Ford Jubilee, a $200 reminder that the most valuable things in life are often hidden beneath the heaviest rust.